Chase, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, and the pleasure is mine. You know, it's been really great getting to know you a little bit over the last few weeks, and very appreciative of Jason Roth formalizing the introduction for us. I guess that's as good a place as any to start. You know, he's
Sure.
one half of one of your recording projects, Neon Cities,
Yep.
which has definitely garnered a bit of notoriety. What can you tell us about the origins of that?
Jason and I go back as friends for quite some time. And we've always casually kind of worked on music here and there. And at one point we were just like, well, why don't we make a project out of this? We both had some time. I was like not touring and he was pretty free. So we just started composing and it kind of turned into what it is. Just like a first time of like sitting down and being like, let's make this a serious project versus just like working on casual tunes here and there.
Right. And of course, I can tell that you're a bit of a sci-fi fan, not just from the synthwave vibe of what Neon Cities is all about, but also from the title of your debut EP, which was kind of a pleasant nod to one of my favorite cyberpunk authors, William Gibson.
Yeah, absolutely. That's both Jason and mine's doing. He's a big sci-fi reader. I'm more of like a film guy, but that's definitely a factor. There's a number of song titles that reference miscellaneous sci-fi things, between the Death Race reference and like the Replicants. It's all kind of tied into that, and we just thought it married nicely with like the sort of synthwave aesthetic, because there's this whole kind of like cyberpunk / synthwave thing that happens, and we were like, we can play into this pretty comfortably.
Yeah, well, that's amazing to me. As a composer and a producer myself, I find that I can't really definitively perform any style.
No.
It's like I start making something, and whatever that ends up being is whatever style it is. But
for sure.
You've got some very definitive styles that you pursue very clearly. And we'll get into your new album here, but. Whether it's Perpetual Motion with, kind of a Detroit, techno kind of sound, something along the lines of Basic Channel even, all the way into Neon Cities with the synthwave. I mean, you've got a very definitive capability of going straight into the heart of the style.
Yeah, I think over the years, I've kind of been messing around with this stuff since about 97, and the music analysis side of thing really helps. It's like, I know that I need to program drums in a specific way, or, it needs these sort of synth elements to kind of like, to align with genres. And I found that, like, because I do a lot of different things from industrial to techno to the synthwave and ambient stuff, it like helps me to just like, for periods of time, focus on one genre. So what you'll see are like, all these releases are kind of just like little snapshots of time, be them 6 months or be them a year or whatever. Yeah,
well, it's very clear to me that there's a lot of crafting that goes into all of your production.
Thank you. I've spent a lot of time at it.
Yeah. I mean, it's very clear. You can hear it immediately. The production quality, just the characters of the synths that you choose. I mean, there's a lot of labor of love that has gone into these productions of yours.
Absolutely. And it's been really, I feel fortunate because I am a synth technician in my day job, so it really allows me to, I'm not the guy that does the desk job and then comes home and works on synths. It's like, it all informs itself, so going into a studio and working with a different artist and kind of seeing how they approach things may inform how I work when I come back, and then sometimes vice versa, I'll be like, hey guys, what do you think about trying it this way? And they have like this aha moment, That's
amazing. I'm so completely envious because you're living a lifestyle that I can only fantasize about. But so let's talk about the day job a little bit. You've got some big name players that are part of your regular routine, and I mean, we were just chatting before the recording here about getting ready to get on the road again with one of them who's, one of my current faves, Rufus Du Sol. But you've done extensive work with Tycho. We were just chatting about some work that you were doing with David J. at Bauhaus. I mean, it's pretty clear why you've got a lot of eclecticism in your production, given, the variety of folks that you tend to be working with.
And I'm a really big music fan, so there's not much that comes across my desk or like my emails where I'm like, this isn't really my thing, Early on in the quote unquote day job, I was working in kind of like the hip hop and R&B realm, and that sort of like shifted my focus for a little bit. Not that I was producing that stuff, but it just kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things that wouldn't normally come across my path as being somebody who is like kind of goth and metal adjacent with a lot of like electronic music influence, But I've been working with Rufus for about 5 years now. Started in their touring capacity only, but over the past year we toured so extensively that the guys are working on a new record, and they've had me come on to work on some engineering duties and just kind of like miscellaneous things to make their lives easier. as they've separated. Two of the guys live in Miami now, and one lives in San Diego. So instead of them being all Cali-centric where they can work together a lot, now they have these writing trips planned. And part of my job is just making sure that all the equipment that they need and want arrives in time and is set up and is kind of ready to go for them, so they can walk in and just kind of do the work versus having a lot of downtime doing technical stuff.
Let's back up a step before we get into the new album. But I think there's kind of a common bridge between what you just walked us through and where you're going with your current album. You'd talked about that. Really for you, kind of your musical journey started around the time you were 14, and you'd messaged to me that at that time you were really trying to emulate someone like Robin Guthrie, who's in a decidedly different category with dream pop, than.
Yeah, absolutely. In the high school years, I picked up on the shoegaze stuff, and even though I'm a little young for it, it being super fresh as it came out, it was definitely around, and there were some great record shops when I was living in Tampa that had a lot of that music. So when I was 11, I got an acoustic guitar for Christmas. It was like learning how to play like Nirvana and Pearl Jam songs and that kind of stuff. And then I got turned on to like Slowdive and Cocteau Twins and all these things, and I was like, what is that and how do I get to there? So I just really started obsessing on like textural music and how guitar could be processed in ways to get into that reverby, ethereal kind of big sound. And it's really just informed everything that I've done since. Because now I do focus more on synthesizers now than I do on guitar, although I still play guitar a lot. It's still a very similar approach. I'm like looking for texture and like, I'm not the guy who's going to sit down and just like play a piano melody. It's always going to be this kind of like washy, big atmospheric thing.
Oh, that's great. I didn't hear you mention My Bloody Valentine in there. Were they an influence at all?
Oh, they're definitely in of course. Love it.
Yeah, same.
I've Hawkeyed a lot of that gear over the time, and it's just like occasionally I'll see something come across my path, and I'm like, I know that was used on Loveless. I'm going to get it. So there's little boxes from the 80s and 90s here that kind of like perform some duties that I'm a
that's
big
so
fan
cool.
of.
I love that. Well, I love all that sound that you're just describing as well. So, and you've mentioned a little bit about industrial too. I know that you had also mentioned that MIDI was influenced in part by what you had learned about what Trent Reznor was doing with MIDI, and
yeah, absolutely.
Kind of share a little bit about that, and who are some of your industrial influences?
Yeah, I'm a huge Skinny Puppy fan. Like, just to this day, still a huge Skinny Puppy fan. But like, early on, kind of like getting exposed to that music and hearing all these machines doing this work, and reading, it was like kind of early days of the internet where you could read interviews and whatnot. And it's like, these guys are able to work like one or two people to do these things, and that really appealed to me, because when I was like living in Florida, I wasn't finding musicians who were interested in the same things. So realizing that there was like relatively inexpensive recording technology and then like computer tools that I could use to offset the number of people that are involved was a really big thing for me. So, and it allowed me to just like work in a very insular way, where it's like I didn't have the distractions of collaboration and all that stuff. It was just like narrow focus, let's get the stuff done. That said, I didn't release music for a long time because I'm really scattered. That's why you'll hear me talk about so many different genres. So to like finally pare it down to be like, oh yeah, this is a cohesive block of music to release didn't happen for a very, very long time.
Just looking at your Bandcamp page, I mean, seeing how much material that you've put out, really, really long time. Again, it seems like you've been very consistent, just from my perspective and looking at how many releases you've got. It
almost started when I moved to Denver in like 2008, I want to say. Because prior to that, I was mixing bands in Tampa like 5 nights a week, and it was really hard to like get that focus in. And while I was doing that here, like my first job as an audio engineer was at the Three Kings Tavern. I still had more free time and was able to just like apply more of a narrow focus. Because what happened is I get into that basic channel stuff. I got into the minimal techno, so I've got a release out that was like highly influenced by like Mono Lake and kind of Fluxion and a lot of those like 90s artists that were doing like Chain Reaction records and that kind of thing, and branched out into IDM from there. And like it's just kind of been this circle of like different styles of like kind of technical driven music.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear you say technical driven music, because when I listen to I can just open up any one of your releases and select a track, and I hear the same characteristics in the production, from my opinion. There's a lot of warmth. Okay. There's there's a lot of depth to the synth characteristics that are in it, and there's a lot of production technique that it's very clearly structured and very deliberate. So when you say very technical, are all of those things factoring into how you would define that?
Yeah, I think so. Like a lot of the early stuff that I was really interested in revolved around like a lot of heavy like production or percussion production, especially in the IDM and kind of like the minimal techno stuff, because it was all about just like very specific types of tones. And then for synths, for me, like I was saying, with having this background in like the shoegaze and the dream pop stuff, it was always like, let's lush out the synths and make the percussion this like finely detailed kind of focused thing. And that was like where a juxtaposition that I always really enjoyed. You know, it's like we could have a synth pad that goes on forever, but all the drums are going to be doing all these like tiny mechanical little, you know, things. So it gives people like different points of focus, I think. You know, there's certain people who are like, wow, I really like how pretty and ambient this is. And then like somebody who is a little more tech driven might be like, oh, there's really interesting stuff happening with these hi-hats and snares and whatnot, you know?
Yeah, you just described how my wife and I both listen to music differently.
Absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned that, because with Neon Cities, it was the first thing that I was like trying to do that was meant to be more of like, could be a passive listen versus something that you needed to really like take in and focus on. It was like, oh yeah, there's some pop songs here, and there's like, you know, like I'm singing and playing guitar and some things, and it's like, it's just a very different thing, in my opinion, to the material that I was doing before or after that. It was like, let's put out some music that people may want to put on while they are making dinner. You know, it doesn't have to be this like hard-nosed focus, like nerdy thing, especially like in the like fringes of industrial and like IDM music and glitch. There's so much making music for other musicians versus like thinking about what a broader audience may be interested in.
Yeah, no, that's good.
So there's definitely a turning point there, and that's where I think everything post Neon Cities has kind of gone. I was like, is this something that like somebody wants to throw on at the club, or is this something that, you know, somebody wants to put on while they're chilling at the house, you know? And that's kind of where I landed with the most recent release, was something that could be a passive listen or something that could be like a very focused, like intentional listen.
Well, let's just go there, since you already took us there. The mechanics of time travel. First of all, I love the title. What was the inspiration behind the title?
The nature of, I'm very interested in neuroscience, and I'm interested in physics, and I'm interested in the nature of the way our brains perceive reality versus what we can quantify as reality. So I thought the mechanics of time travel was just an interesting way of like playing on the idea that time can be a very relative thing. You know, like some of the most intense moments of our lives can feel like eons, and then you can look back on them years later and go, that was a blip on the radar. You know, so I just thought it's a fascination that I've had for a lot of years. It kind of ties into the sci-fi thing, but also into some like science as well. Yeah,
well, and you know, I mean, even the design of the album cover art, you know, and the typeface, I mean, everything just kind of feeds into that same thing. You know, it's very sciencey, but kind of science fiction-y.
Yeah, very happy with the way that came out. My buddy Mike Hayway did the graphic design, and that was actually a photograph that I took at the White Sands National Forest down in New Mexico. So I was out there just shooting digital SLR stuff, and when we started talking about like what the record should look like, we were referencing a lot of like old Warp Records covers and some of the like the basic channels and things like that, a lot of like the 90s kind of like European technical music, and we were like, maybe we want to do something that's a little more warm and organic. And that's how we landed on that. And the typeface that he came up with was like just an idea he had, and I was like, we have to go with this because it just implies motion, you know, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, the whole thing just comes together as, you know, one unified whole. In fact, you know, musically, to me, the album is so consistently good that it's really tough to just put my finger on any one single track and say, let's talk about that, because the whole thing really hangs together like as a unified experience.
You know, this is the first record that I've released with Young Heavy Souls, which is a Detroit label. Excuse me. Prior, I had done some mixing and mastering work for some of their artists, so I had a little bit of a relationship with them, but this is the first time I like proposed, like, hey, here's a body of work. And it was really, we had a lot of conversations about how to market it, and what we landed on is like, it's really hard to pick a single off of this record. You know, it's like, oh, what's the thing you're going to lead with? Because we've really, you know, set the thing up to be a full listen. And what visually speaking of, you know, when Young Heavy Souls hit me up about doing the video for because there's a 40-minute video visualizer for the entire record. I was like, what song do you want to do? And they're like, no, I want to do the entire record. And when I started getting those proofs back, I was like, we're definitely aligned in the vision, because I had done a lot of like video editing of drone footage that I had kind of like stolen from YouTube that I was intending to use for like visuals for future shows. And then Matt, the owner of the record label, hits me with this video, and I'm like, apparently we've got the same vision, because this is like lining up so well. It was just very serendipitous.
Well, so, and I'm glad to hear that you feel that it is a sort of single listening experience, because to me, and you and I had been chatting about this, it's got very much a Boards of Canada kind of, feel to a lot of the musical characteristics in it, especially, I think a lot of the percussive elements. But I also think of the way that, an album like Music Has the Right to Children, just flows together.
Sure.
They both sound like they had some degree of influence on you.
Yeah, it would be a lie for me to say that I wasn't heavily influenced by those two records. They're kind of burned in my brain from when they came out, because I listened to them so heavily. And I knew that at some point I was going to try to sit down and focus on something that had that influence to it. And it wasn't until the COVID shutdown that I had the time to really just have a singular focus again and be like, okay, this is the record that I want to make. I want to rely less on like kind of like clever programming in the computer and just play more instruments. And I think it's reflected. Like if you listen to material from a few years back versus something that on the new record, it feels to me more musical, because I'm actually playing a lot more synth than I am recording little bits and chopping them into like, this piece. So
yeah, I noticed that call out in the liner notes, and I was kind of curious about that, because as we referenced earlier, you referred to the sort of the technical nature of a lot of the music. What has kind of contributed to that? Is it in part some of the influences that you've had, like working with Rufus, or just kind of independently arrived there yourself?
Over the course of a couple of years, I picked up a couple of synthesizers that really lent me more towards longer performances, just due to the hands-on nature of them. So like I rely really heavily on the Moog Sub 37 for bass, and it's just got this gorgeous interface. And instead of being like, I want to record a measure of this bass line, I want to record the entire track of that bass line. I mean, it's been programmed via MIDI,
sure.
But like instead of being like copy paste, I'll record 6 minutes of it while I'm like at the dials, like making it change so it just has this organic kind of flow. So between the Moog Sub 37 and the Prophet 08, I had two boxes that just really spoke to me in like a hands-on kind of way. So those were like the two things. Like I think every tune on there, with the exception of maybe one or two, were started with those two boxes.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so I'll start with like by looping a bunch of elements and then developing it up, and then once I have an arrangement made, that's when I'll go through and make final recordings of the things.
Well, the Prophet has got to be a hell of a fun toy to
yeah, for sure,
with as well.
Most definitely. And they both have the ability to kind of like sound unstable in ways. Like I'm a big fan of analog synths in that regard, because they can have tuning issues and they can have all these things, and it just adds to like what I consider like synth nostalgia. It's like what I think about in really cool synth tones or sounds from the 70s and 80s. And then as we move into like higher tech stuff, everything gets more stable,
right? And
at times it starts to get to this kind of like sterile vibe, which is great if you're looking for like perfect music, but I'm not terribly interested in perfect music. But I like when things are overdriven a little bit, or like maybe I have to turn the reverb up too high or whatever. Just like all those things kind of contribute to like, I think, an overall kind of tonality that I really tried to capitalize on this recent record. I've been told by friends that it's a very analog sounding record, and I'm like, well, I still recorded it with a computer, but everything I relied on prior to the computer was an analog synth or processing of some sort.
Imagination.
let's talk a little bit about, backing up again to, sort of your origins of learning music and composing. Have you gone through traditional musical training? Are you all self-taught?
No, when I got that first guitar when I was 11, my parents stuck me in guitar lessons. And a few months later, my grades started to slip in school, and they were like, no, we're going to get you back on track with the thing. And I found that, like, having that primer, just a little bit of knowledge on, like, the basics, here's a handful of chords, here's how you get around the instrument, helped me to then just kind of, like, extrapolate that information in learning other people's songs. Because, like, at the time, guitar magazines were big, and you could be like, oh, I can learn how to play, this Helmet song, or I can learn how to play this Rob Zombie song, or whatever it was. And, like, just kind of taking all that stuff in allowed me to just kind of get a grasp on how composition works. And once I got into both multi-tracking and synthesizers, it was just like, oh, this guy's the limit here. And it allowed me to kind of, like, develop a little bit of an ear with the guitar and then apply that to the keyboard in a clumsy way until it starts becoming, like, a little more dialed, and it just kind of, like, built organically. In college, I took a couple of electronic music courses, which definitely helped with, like, an understanding of how audio in a studio works. And also the kind of the very fundamentals of, like, MIDI sequencing was super helpful. And then after that, it was working in music shops and mixing bands live in bars and in clubs. So it just kind of, like, all kind of came together organically. Like we had said before in messaging, I kind of put all my eggs in one basket, for better or for worse. It's like, oh, if you weren't doing music, what would you do? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm not going to be an accountant. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think there are a lot of great artists who have benefited from the fact that they've got a very singular focus. So, I think that's, as much as you describe yourself as scattered, I think that seems to be, like, the cohesion that helps pull everything together for you.
I think I'm just scattered because I have a lot of interests, like music, like in terms of, like, music genre and whatnot. It's like I'd love to have all the time in the world to be able to focus on A, B, C, or D, but it's like now I've, like, made a record that I feel like I want to follow up material, like, in a similar vein, and just kind of keep cruising in this zone for a while, because it's really satisfying because it is so close, like, to the influences that I've had over the years, where it just feels very very genuine, which is, like, I think important.
Yeah, well, there's definitely an authenticity to your sound. Even though I can hear influences of a variety of things, and that's how artists operate, right? But for your music catalog, as I listen through to things, there's definitely like I can hear you in all of these different releases, even though, like, we're talking about very disparate styles or subgenres that you've been exploring. So you had also messaged me that when you were 14, you got a 4-track recorder. Was that kind of the foundation of mixing?
Yeah, that was the beginning of it, and I think I lied. I believe I was 16 because I was able to drive to the music store to pick stuff up. But it was all like I had a job mowing lawns and I had a job working at a mailboxes, etc. And, like, just saved up the cash to get a cassette 4-track, and that was really the beginning, And it was like me recording things off the radio, and then, like, guitars through pedals and drum machines and all this stuff. And it was really the first time that I had tools enough to be able to make a composition. It's like I could record drums on one track and then guitar on another, and maybe sing some terrible stuff into it. And I was like, oh, this is like, this is writing. It was more composing than, like, songwriting. Whereas where a lot of people, like, they get a good guitar or piano and they're, like, very, very linear thing. They're like, okay, verse, chorus, verse, bridge, etc. Like, I was able to, like, think about sound in terms of, like, layers versus linearity. And that's definitely stuck with me. Yeah,
and also still a very analog process. I mean, you were just reliant on the tape, right? I mean, you weren't going to computer for any of that.
No, that didn't happen for another 3 or 4 years.
That's wild.
So I was, like, doing all 4-track recording, and, like, a lot of it will never see the light of day. Like, I had an apartment flood because there's hurricanes, and I lost a lot of that material. But these days, it's all on hard drives, and I just have hard drives upon hard drives of stuff.
Yes, I know the drill. So did that lend itself to your, like, was that foundational for you to be able to go and do work mixing other bands?
Yeah, just in being the type of person that's like always trying to soak up knowledge, being in an environment where like I got thrown to the wolves. Like the first thing that I mixed live was part of a music festival, and I had like an Irish punk band, I had a bluegrass band, I had like all this stuff, and it was like some of it was really bad. Like because you set up a bunch of microphones on a stage that you've never worked on for a bluegrass band. It was not a good first evening. But you fast forward 6 weeks and you've mixed 30, 40 different bands and in the same environment with the same tools, and all of a sudden you start to really get a grasp of like what's ahead of you. So I do think spending 3 or 4 nights behind a mixer mixing 3 or 4 bands a night super helped like just push forward the production skills, because it's all the same tools. If you're mixing a rock band or a country band or even a bluegrass band, which I can pull off now, it's all the same tools. You just need to know how they're applied to different genres. And then always having a computer that I was recording on gave me an environment to mix and just experiment with different techniques and textures and all that stuff. So it was very informative to be mixing metal bands and coming home and working on ambient music, because like for some reason in my brain there's a line that connects the two.
That's beautiful.
And then if you take a look at like, if you get into like Norwegian black metal and all that stuff, they figured it out too. You've got these guys that make really scary music and they turn around and they put out like an acoustic ambient thing that's gorgeous. Yeah. So I'm like, I'm not the only one here.
So 2 parts to this question. Number 1, what's your favorite mixing experience so far? Like, does it have to do with a piece of equipment? Does it have to do with the studio? Ooh. And 2, who has been your favorite artist to work with in a mixing capacity?
Ooh, that's a real difficult question. I would say that like one of the more profound and kind of the bigger mixing experiences I've had was I was brought into Tycho's camp to work as a tech. They didn't have anybody working on the stage, and the band was doing the stuff. And I had gone to a show of theirs in Boulder with some friends who knew the drummer. And I had already been touring at that point, and I was off the road. So we were backstage, and I was chatting with the tour manager, and I was like, oh, yeah, I tour, and I do this. And he like, perked up. He was like, well, what do you do? And I was like, well, I'm a synth guy, and like I also do Ableton programming and all this stuff. And he's like, well, after the show, I want to introduce you to the guys. So basically, I went to the Tycho show and came home with a job. So 2 weeks later, like I went to my sister's wedding, and then I went on the road with Tycho. And I was doing stage stuff, and they were letting house guys do the front of house mix. And at one point, the RTM was like, "You're a mix engineer. Why aren't you mixing?" And I was like, well, because I'm always on this side of the stage. It's like, let's change that. So we went to Australia, and I started mixing Tycho at these festivals, and it was just like fantastic because it was like a band that I had already liked. I mean, I went to their show for a reason, because I like the music, and then to get kind of brought in, and then within months be mixing front of house for them was like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I would say so. That's just an amazing story, and man, talk about alignment of the stars. With something like that, it was
for sure
clearly meant to be.
Yeah, and I've worked in a lot of different roles with that group. Everything from just working on the computer side and kind of like taking their show stems and building them into like a playback system, and then I've done monitor engineering for them. For a while I was their live like projection mapping guy, because it was all just everything they do is tied into computers. So it was like, oh, well, if this computer's tied into this and this computer into that, I'll just go ahead and do all the things. So it was like running around in venues like, oh, I gotta get the video up, gotta make sure the tracks are playing. Band's happy? Okay, cool.
Can I get you a beer?
They're asking me that. Tearing my hair out.
I love it.
No, it was a great few years though. Got to see Asia, got to see Australia. We did Germany, we did all through Europe. And it was just like a really great time.
Well, and it also sounds like, surrounded by people who have made music their careers. So, I mean, what kind of powerful influence is that?
And it's actually been, like I said, very informative to go out and have the opportunity to work with some of these artists, because they are people who have, overcome some hurdles to become successful in a meaningful way, and just being in that environment and understanding what all goes into a show is helpful for an artist who, like, I may have been recording music for years and years and years, but me as a live performer is kind of an emerging thing. So like I've already got an idea of how to overstep some of the pitfalls that like a new artist on stage might figure out, because I'm like, I played Black Box a few weeks ago, and it was like I had all set up, ready to go. The sound guy was like, "You're just set and ready to go?" I'm like, "Yup." He's like, "All right, well, let's sound check it." And it was like a 10-minute sound check, and he was like, everything was happy. It's like, how did you? I was like, I spent a lot of time on tour doing this stuff. And he's like, I see what's going on here. I'm like the most over-prepared local musician you'll ever encounter.
That is pretty cool.
Thanks.
What do your parents think now about the grade slippage, considering what you've been doing with your own career?
I think they're happy to see that it's come to a point where it's something that is reliable. It's like there were a couple of moments in my life where it's like, yeah, I'm going to go on tour with this band. They're like, what? I don't even know what that means. I was like, yeah, they're paying for all the travel. I'm making a decent wage. I'm like, okay, what are you going to do after that tour? I was like, I don't know. And it just lent itself to like, networking and getting other jobs and things. But it's a difficult thing initially for people to wrap their heads around, because it is like it's a very freelance way of being, and it's like, oh, well, what are you going to do after this thing's over? I'm like, well, figure out what's next. It's worked out thus far. I've been very, very thankful for that.
Well, Chase, I want to just talk through a couple of your releases and get your feedback on a couple of things. So, Perpetual Motion, we referred to it a little bit earlier, and to me, it's like I put it on and it's immediately there. Again, there's like a mark of familiarity, whether it's Basic Channel, whether it's some of the Detroit throwback.
Yep.
I mean, again, it's just, it seems to be so immaculately produced, from end to end.
Oh, Thank you for that. Thanks for that. I wrote a lot of that material having started working with Rufus, just being around so much dance music. And like, I really wanted to bring in my love for like dub techno, but kind of like reinvented in a way with a little bit of what you're hearing in some of the melodic techno without moving fully into kind of like progressive house. So there's like synths that drive things, but there's still kind of this propulsive dubby thing that drives that record, and that was the goal there.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of that was produced in Ableton. Is that true?
Yes, that was highly Ableton driven. Yeah. I use a handful of Native Instruments tools in the box, and there wasn't as much hardware as that you hear on the Mechanics of Time Travel.
Well, it's still got a great sound, and again, the whole thing is, it's a cohesive listening experience from beginning to end. Let's talk a little bit about some of your glitchy stuff.
Sure.
So, is it? How do you even say that? The release name?
Oh, I just call it C. Dobson.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's c.db.sn, which sounded really great and looked great on paper until I started trying to explain to people like what it was all about. The elevator pitch for a project called c.db.sn is not the most effective thing. I learned that the hard way.
No, it's okay. It fits.
But it kind of suited the vibe of the project, which was meant to be very fractured and kind of like, dubstep was happening, so there's some dubstep influences without going full on there. And then just, it was like very informed by kind of that post-Audiker, post-industrial kind of thing, and that's where I was shooting for. I was releasing with a record label called Tympanic Audio, which at the time had kind of like about a lot of artists that had come out of the industrial scene that had not gone the trancey direction and gone into a more clicky, glitchy sort of thing. So there was a nice home for that for a while.
It's got, again, to just say that it's like a glitch production, doesn't do it justice, because there's so many different little ancillary, pathways that it takes down, a variety of these subgenres.
Sure.
And you mentioned dubstep. I mean, it's just like, at the end of it all, kicks off with, something that is decidedly dubstep.
Yeah, for sure. It's a matter of like always just kind of pulling from what's in my consciousness at the time, because I was like DJing around town, and like everywhere we go, you were hearing that sounds. And I find that with this genre like dubstep, it is really easy to extrapolate kind of the core fundamentals, halftime beats, and maybe these heavy bass lines, and you can evolve them in different directions. And I think you hear that even now with artists that have taken that to different levels, with your like Sun and Aquarius and all these glitch guys, or these glitch hop guys that have moved out to like really pretty expansive kind of psychedelic stuff, and to think that it all came from like Scream and Benga and all of that, it's like it's so different to what it was. And that was like my take on dubstep as a genre, because there's a couple of tracks on there that do rely on like a heavy kind of wobble bass, but it's all distorted and broken in different ways, and that was just like my play on it.
Yeah, to be honest, it reminds me of some of BT's production, where
oh, cool.
He tends to, if he's not the one who's perpetrating, kind of whatever the new move is within subgenres, which he's done a lot of, he seems to come along and he's like, okay, I got this. Let me show you what can happen to this if we take it to the next level. And,
For sure.
So,
and I just see it as kind of like taking information and creating permutations. Like I'm not trying to redefine genres. Like that. I feel like there's a lot of people that do that well. I'm not that person. I take what I like from things and put my own spin on it.
That's beautiful. Of all of the releases that I've been browsing through on your Bandcamp page, what stands out? And you can't use your current album. Anything prior to the current album, what stands out as like an all-time favorite for you?
Probably At the End of It All. which was the c.db.sn project. It was many, many years in the making, and it was another thing that like I can listen to and feel like it has a cohesion, but realize that like those songs are probably 8 years between the first one and the last one, you know. And it was just something that it was the first thing that came out on an indie label that was outside of Denver, you know, that I had submitted demos to and they were excited about, and it was like the first time that like I was making a quote unquote like legitimate release. And I feel like there's just a good representation of like where my head was at the time with that, between like the dubsteppy stuff and then the more ambient pieces. There's a little post-rock tune in there, you know, there's just kind of a little bit of everything, and I try to like tie it all together with like the textures and kind of the deep reverby things that I use for everything.
Well, it's a gorgeous album, and I love that it's got a companion album with all the remixes on it as well.
Yeah, that was super great. Like, I had a bunch of artists that were kind of tertiary to the label and friends of mine that were involved, and it was great to get like most of the tunes remixed.
Okay, and now go in the other direction. Mechanics of Time Travel. What's your favorite standout on that album?
Oh, the title track for sure. You know, I named it after, you know, the record came about, the concept came about, and then I was like, this is the tune for it. And I had sampled a bunch of Art Bell Coast to Coast audio, and that's where a lot of, if your listeners hear the tune, there's about halfway through, there's a bunch of garbled, what sounds like vocal syllables, and it's literally taking Art Bell having a conversation with a guy about time travel, cut up and glitched up into a certain way that just, you know, that sounds really engaging. And it's a very kind of like Boards of Kennedy approach of taking a vocal and not using it as a vocal, but using it as a percussive element. And I just feel like compositionally that one is really strong, and I was really pleased with the mix on it as well. So I would say that would be my recommendation for like the elevator pitch for that record.
Well,
you know, it's like, if you've got one tune to listen to, here's the one.
You've been listening to a special edition of Electronic Air right here on listener-powered KGNU. I'm E23. Big shouts to my special guests, Jason Roth, aka CrowdRock, whose latest album, The Cold Facts, just dropped this week on the Class Action imprint, and Chase Dobson, whose newest album, The Mechanics of Time Travel, is available from Young Heavy Souls on digital and vinyl formats. You can check them both out on Bandcamp as well as wherever else you buy your music digitally. Big thanks to them, and I hope that you'll choose to support these artists local to Colorado. To check out the full playlist of tonight's program as well as to download an MP3 of the entire show, be sure to check out our archives at afterfm.com. I'm E23. Be sure to join us every Saturday night from 9 p.m. to 11 right here on KGNU, Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins.